9 a.m. in Shanghai, Shenzhen, and here in Hong Kong, you're watching The China Show. I'm Yvonne Man with David Ingles.
We are counting down to the open of markets in Greater China. Let's get to your top stories today. Stocks across the region on the down right now after this rally globally stumbling. Oil, as you can see on your screens, rebounding after Iran says the terms of the ceasefire with the U.S. were breached.
U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance is set to lead direct talks with Iran in Pakistan this weekend, while President Trump lashes out against NATO.
Now, China trumpets its own efforts in pushing for the ceasefire. We'll be hearing from the Beijing Club for international dialogue on the role the country has played.
Plus, with the Strait of Hormuz still largely closed, we'll be speaking with Japanese shipping and logistics company Mitsui O.S.K's new CEO on how the company is being impacted by the conflict. Well, after the initial optimism, I think we're starting to see that momentum fading a bit there. There are some doubts and questions about the ceasefire and really the durability of this rally in some ways, because for one thing, we've seen a lot of developments when it comes to Lebanon in the last 24 hours. And I think Iran has also talked about the violations, as you mentioned, that the U.S. allegedly has broken so far. So I think right now we could say it's a fragile truce.
Or what truce? Or what truce,
or
right?
What, yeah.
Ahead of the Saturday, of course, negotiations still to take place, right? And I think we understand that J.D. Vance, of course, is headed there to discuss that as well. But yes, it's a good point because markets needed to cover some positions, go long in some. We were lighter on either side. But it was shortly, a few hours after the initial flurry of news on the ceasefire, where I think the initial one that stood out this time yesterday was Lebanon was actually part of it, to your point. And then Benjamin Netanyahu came out and said, "Hey, just a minute. Lebanon should not actually be part of any conversation. We weren't covering that specific item." And then that's when things started to unravel. And then you had this whole flurry of news going into today, where I think markets are now trying to figure out and trying to split the difference between pre-announcement and where reality stands.
I think you're seeing it first in the Treasury market, where bond investors are quick to kind of see that there are two-sided risks involved when it comes to this, right? When you're talking about some sort of ceasefire, does that limit the amount of rate cuts that we'll see in this market as well? So certainly there's a lot of questions about that right now. And we're seeing a little bit of whipsaw, not just in bonds, a little bit in the FX markets, a little bit in stocks here this morning. But then again, it does show, when you're talking about one of the largest assaults in Lebanon from Israel, targeting more than 100 Hezbollah command sites within 10 minutes, I think that does lead to a bit more nerves here among investors, really kind of looking forward on really what to come next as we count down to these talks on Friday.
And it's also on the other side, right? I'd also point out that there is very little indication that the flow of vessel traffic through the Strait of Hormuz is free-flowing.
That was the first thing that Iran said, right? Yes. After saying that they would allow some passageway of some vessels, once we heard news on Lebanon, I think they started saying, look, we're going to close it once again and threaten them.
And I think when you look at markets today, you're right. So the Fed minutes were from 3 weeks ago, and I think they've stated already in the minutes what we were waiting for anyway, that if this was prolonged, then the risk of a hike is a lot more real. And what the markets did with that was they reversed the strength that you point out earlier on in terms of the Treasury markets, right? In fact, when you look at 10-year futures, are now effectively back to levels before the Truth Social post of Donald Trump. The dollar is actually now back effectively to levels at the start of the year. And when you look at Chinese markets separately, there's also this tech conversation. I think we can get to that later on. When you look at markets in the Asia Pacific, and perhaps another theme that is starting to emerge is really we've ignored AI perhaps a little bit too much, and because that is continuing to brew across these markets going into, of course, the Thursday session here.
Yep, let's get to our top story here right now, where U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance is set to lead talks with Iran and Pakistan on Saturday morning local time. And it comes as Tehran says a ceasefire has been violated, and after Israel continued its attacks, as we mentioned, on Hezbollah militia in Lebanon.
If Iran wants to let this negotiation fall apart in a conflict where they were getting hammered over Lebanon, which has nothing to do with them and which the United States never once said was part of the ceasefire, that's ultimately their choice.
Let's get into our politics editor, Laura Davison. She's with us here right now. So some doubts are creeping in about the ceasefire right now.
Doubts are creeping in, and it seems like there may be two different ceasefires that Iran agreed to and the U.S. agreed to. And once the rubber hit the road here, they were like, whoa, wait, that's not what we talked about on both sides. We have, Iran saying that, hold on, Lebanon, Hezbollah was covered, and Israel saying, no, that's a whole separate issue. Trump sort of brushed that off, saying they'd be taken care of, but again, didn't really seem to have any action plan for how to address that. Separately, on the Strait of Hormuz, we heard different things yesterday from Iran, and we're seeing that play out, where they're saying, we'll allow ships with safe passage. The U.S. wanted free travel. Those are two very different things of, Iran military allowing a handful of their hand-chosen ships to go through versus, 135 ships a day like we saw, before the war started. So there's a lot going into these talks in Islamabad on Saturday means that they're probably going to be talking about these top-line issues, not getting down to some of those second and third order things like the nuclear program, like what a more lasting peace would look like, which really risks just delaying this entire process going forward.
Give us a preview of the talks, though, coming through on Saturday.
Yeah, so this is going to be, J.D. Vance will be leading on the U.S. side. These will be in Islamabad. Pakistan has been a pretty effective mediator so far, and that they have the trust of both sides and have been able to navigate this. We'll see if that holds up once you get everybody in a room. This will be interesting for Vance in particular. One, because he was not a big fan of this war going into it, and that's part of why he was chosen, because he's seen as someone with credibility on all sides of this, and not a very a war hawk like some other folks in the Trump universe might be. Plus, there's a lot of political risk for him too. He wants to run for president, and now he owns this issue, and that he will, so how he navigates this, both from the immediate, geopolitical standpoint, as well as what this means for his own personal political future, will be weighing on these talks. Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, Steve Witkoff will also be in the room. They've really been the top negotiators. So it's interesting that we're seeing a little bit of a pivot here, from who Trump has tapped to negotiate on Gaza, on Ukraine. Now Vance is going to be leading on Iran.
It seems like China is maybe starting a little bit more of a mediator sort of role in this as well. There have been some reports out there saying that it was almost like a last-minute intervention that the Chinese had in trying to get these talks and really trying to get some sort of ceasefire. How significant is that?
This is quite significant, and really kind of all sides seem to be acknowledging the power that China has in these negotiations. She hasn't commented publicly that China had sort of at the start of this war really kept an arm's length from this, but has been playing a very strong role behind the scenes. We saw Trump acknowledge yesterday that he believes that it was that nudge from China that got Iran to sign on to the ceasefire. The Iranian ambassador in China commented yesterday, that he sees China as being a guarantor of peace in this conflict, and China also acknowledged that they've been doing their own efforts here. So China could sort of be a secret whisperer to talk to all sides.
Laura, thank you. Laura Davison there, our Bloomberg Politics editor. Let's have a look at the market component of all of this. Mark Cranfield is with us out of Singapore, our MLive strategist. Mark, markets are not completely reversing, obviously, yesterday's move, but we're somewhat seeing markets taking a step back and thinking, really, where are we when it comes to this?
Yeah, it's hardly surprising. The moves yesterday were euphoric. They're enormous across asset classes, and it's bound to have a bit of pulling back from that. It looks like volumes are relatively low so far today, and people are just in a bit of a wait-and-see mood, which is hardly surprising when you hear what Laura has to say. These negotiations are not going to be easy for people to understand. There's a lot of moving parts in here, and it could even be two potential ceasefires going on here as well. So there's a lot for traders to digest as they look forward to the talks here. The bottom line, though, really, is that what traders are pricing here is, does President Trump want to move on from the conflict in Iran? And for now, they are assuming he does. So whatever happens over the next few days, whatever the talks go, they're taking the stance that he is working towards an exit from the situation that we've seen over the past few weeks. That is positive for markets. It doesn't take us back exactly to where we were in March before the whole thing started, but it is a long step towards it. That's why the rebounds in the markets were so huge yesterday, and why we're only seeing very small pullbacks from that. There's a much higher bar now. Investors are assuming it's very much a glass is now half full rather than half empty. They can see daylight down the tunnel here. They can see things starting to improve. Even like today, we're discussing the AI story once again in equity markets. That's a big shift back to where we were pre-war. People are starting to look again at earnings. They're starting to think about where companies are going to be making money in the tech world, looking at what central bank stance is going to be, economic data. These things are starting to come back into the conversation. It's not completely normal, but we're moving back towards the kind of world we had pre-Iran war. Of course, oil prices are considerably higher than they were back then, and they're going to stay high for some time is the likely scenario. But the bar is very high. Traders are much more optimistic than they were just a week ago.
Right, and as you mentioned, the whole AI theme seems to be emerging again. The Meta joining in on this whole AI model fray. You have Anthropic with news on cloud. It seems like the software side of things is being whacked again. But in terms of Asia, though, we saw a lot of foreign buying into Korea, a lot of foreign buying into Taiwan. Is that part of the trade still intact, you think?
Yeah, if you think of where we were in the early stages of the year, Samsung, Taiwan Semiconductor, Hynix, these were the big stocks driving the whole Asian story. To a large extent, not a huge amount has changed in terms of those companies. Just last week, Samsung posted fantastic profits again for the period. So really the underlying story is still very healthy for the major companies making the big bucks in Asia. Just the war interrupted the process in terms of the risk-reward situation. So people, and the signs are that foreigners were very heavy sellers of big names like Samsung. There's a lot of rebuilding to be done here. No wonder the volumes were quite chunky yesterday across the board. People need to get back in. If you look at the MSCI World Gauge, it dipped nicely below its 200-day moving average, and it's already starting to go back into positive territory above that. That's normally a pretty good indicator that dip buying was quite serious when it mattered, and it will take a lot for people to pull back from that. Look at the Japanese outflows. Japanese timed it perfectly. At the beginning of the quarter, the outflows were the biggest, or the Japanese purchases of foreign stocks were the biggest for 11 months. They got in at just the right time, and now they're being rewarded already.
Mark, it's great to have you. Mark Cranfield there, our MLI strategist, joining us out of Singapore here. Yeah, maybe we've moved past the Iran situation, given how uncertain it is, and maybe there are still some key themes there for investors to kind of sink their teeth into. Coming up, we're going to talk this still, though, when it comes to the situation in Iran and really China's role in all this, right? China touting its own efforts in pushing for a U.S.-Iran ceasefire. We'll be digging into that with the Beijing Club for International Dialogue next. And we're coming down to the open of trade in Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong. This is The China Show.
Welcome back. You're watching The China Show. China has touted its efforts, trumpeted its efforts, really, if you think about it, to secure the ceasefire between both sides. You have U.S. and Iran, of course, coming together, and hopefully we'll be having a constructive conversation over the weekend in Islamabad on Saturday. Now, shortly after, of course, President Trump then gave Beijing credit for playing a pivotal role in this. But the China's foreign ministry, did not directly address reports that it actually helped convince Tehran.
China has consistently advocated for an end to the war and the resolution of disputes through political and diplomatic means to ultimately achieve lasting peace and stability in the Middle East and the Gulf region. China has also made its own efforts in this regard.
Joining us now from Beijing is Wang Jin, Senior Fellow at the Beijing Club for International Dialogue, a think tank that advises the Chinese government on politics. Wang Jin, it's great to have you. I think we're trying to understand a little bit more about China's involvement in this conflict here right now. There have been some reports of possibly some sort of intervention in the last minute here to get Iran to agree to this ceasefire. Can you tell us a bit more about what you know on China's role in all this?
Hi, Yvonne. I don't think I want to use the term of the intervention, because actually from the Chinese perspective, China hopes to bring the different conflicting parties closer and also together with the efforts from the regional countries, of course, with the other, including other international community members. I think the China's efforts could be included into two dimensions. First of all, China communicated very closely with different members and different states in this region. For example, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has already made countless calls. I cannot remember exactly the number, but countless calls during the past 1 month with regional countries, Qatar, Saudi, even Iran, and also other very major powers, including maybe Russia and maybe Pakistan, to try to enhance the very consensus over the ongoing war. That means the war should be suspended and the peace should come back. And also, on the other hand, China and some other regional countries, particularly Pakistan, put forward the so-called 5-point initiative not long ago, call for the end of the war. So that's why I think China has already tried our best to bring the two different conflicting parties together. And we are very happy that the war now comes into the very opportunity of peace. And it's very crucial for everybody to make the decision. So, but no matter how, I think it's a very optimistic moment right now. Yvonne.
Yeah, optimistic in terms of the amount of campaigning that China is doing. What's different this time? I bring it back to Ukraine, when there were calls from the international community at the time for China to really try to step in a bit more diplomatically, but China never did. What's different this time, you think?
No. China actually did a lot of things. I mean, I don't quite understand that why there were so many criticisms that China should do this, China should do that. On one hand, China is strong, but not that enough to be able to influence every country's leader's decision over the very specific and particular issue. That is impossible because China is only a normal country in the international community. China cannot determine the other country's decision and cannot determine the other country's behaviors, including Iran and the United States. They are independent countries based upon their own independent decision-making circle. So that's why China can only try to persuade and try to give opinion to their leaders at home and cannot determine what they could do. And also, on the other hand, I think China has already tried to do a lot of things from the United Nations Security Council level, from the multilateral and the bilateral level, try to give a lot of the positive atmosphere under which the kind of the peace opportunities could be enhanced and cultivated. So that's why I think China has already done a lot. And we can, and also last but not least, China is not the only country who contributed for the peace process. A lot of other countries, as we have to stress, for example, Turkey, for example, Egypt, for example, particularly Pakistan, all has already done a lot of things for the bringing the different conflicting parties together. So that's why I think we could say that this is a very important result, positive result of the ceasefire, reached not only by China, but also based upon the very bilateral efforts from the international community. That is very, very important, Yvonne.
So, Wang Jin, this is David. So what then would China's next move be?
I think China will try to, first of all, David, I think you put forward a very crucial question on what could be the future. I think China hopes that the United States and Iran, that their negotiation could be successful, although we know it's very difficult, because if we compare what the United States, before they put forward the so-called 15-point plan, with the Iran put forward the so-called 10-point plan. Actually, everything is opposite. Everything is conflicting. So let's be frank. I think it would be a very, very long and tough negotiation between the two conflicting parties when the crisis and the uncertainties of going back to war still remain and remain very high. And also, we cannot forget that some countries in the region and some actors in this region, for example, the Yemen Houthi, the Israel, the Hezbollah from Lebanon, they still have the motivations to restart the war. So there were still a lot of uncertainties out of the control from the United States, out of the control from Iran. So I think China hopes that the peace negotiation will continue, the peace opportunities would remain. And also, on the other hand, I think China would try together with other regional countries to try to maintain this kind of the bridge for communication between the different parties, because right now the biggest difficulty for United States and Iran is that there is no reliable communication channel between the two countries. Because traditionally, the Gulf Arab states, they are the channel, but now they stand to the very large extent to the opposite side of Iran. So that's why I think China will continue to contribute. Yeah, Yvonne, please.
Wang Jin, you had a good point about, there's only so much China can do, right? Beijing has influence on certain countries in different degrees and different levels. I'm just wondering, in terms of the Iran situation, Why do you think Iran would listen to China? What leverage do you think Beijing has on Tehran?
I also hope that, of course, Iran will listen to Chinese words. But I don't think Iran will do that. First of all, it's a very, very beautiful misunderstanding that Iran will follow other people's advices and other countries' advices. If Iran really did follow their advices, the so-called the order of the other country, there would be no 1979 Iran Islamic Revolution, because with that time Iran does not want to follow the order from United States. They overthrow the older king regime and establish a new Islamic regime. So that's why Iran's Islamic Republic is an independent country without the necessities of following other countries' orders and other countries' direction. So that's why China just hopes to give advices, and to give that advices not only to Iran but also to the Gulf Arab states. So just days ago, China in the United Nations Security Council, they vetoed the proposal from the Gulf Arab states to, for example, to try to militarize this kind of the Gulf Arab region's situation. We call it very dangerous because we don't want the region going deeper into the war circle. So that's why China hopes to give advices, because when the countries, like people, they were in the war, they become irrational. And so that's why the rational advices from the partners are necessary and important. So that's why I think China's contribution should not be concluded as kind of the order, but it's just a kind of the good advices and good kind of the rational advices, suggestions to Iran that we hope Iran could listen. And we are happy that Iran, altogether with the other regional countries, to some extent, follow the advices from China and other regional countries. So this is very good news.
I mean, it is a time for cooler heads to prevail, and certainly stability is very important. Wang Jin, we'd love to continue the conversation, of course. If you could stay put, maybe we'll see what we can do. Senior fellow there at the Beijing Club for International Dialogue, we were barely scratching the surface there. We're down 0.5% going into the session today. Lots more ahead. This is Bloomberg. Right, so welcome back. As we go into the open today, given the lack of further positive and clear-cut catalysts that indicate we are in fact headed for a clean-cut ceasefire, markets are somewhat taking some of the gains from yesterday. So we are set to open slightly to the downside right now. So I think it gives us really more mind space to talk about more things. Yeah,
like tech. Alibaba certainly going to be front and center here after we saw the ADRs drop. That price target was slashed by Jefferies by as much as 13%. They're factoring in higher spending on Quinn promotions in China's AI race here as well. As the stock down some 2.7%. We got the open coming up next. This is Bloomberg.
We saw north of 2 trillion turnover on the onshore markets yesterday. Massive amount of net selling across the Stock Connect, so net sellers as far as mainland investors were concerned, and as far as Hong Kong markets were concerned. And I should also point out on price, the CSI 300 is coming off the single best day in nearly 6 months. So we really punched substantially higher yesterday on.
Yeah, it was euphoric, right? I missed it, but certainly it did show. I mean, how much people were pricing in that this war was going to be prolonged. It looks like right now we retreated some of those moves, but not quite. Treasury markets were quick. I mean, we've kind of reversed nearly all of the gains of yesterday.
And then some more, in fact.
But equities still seem to be, relatively speaking, looking okay. You take a look at how oil markets are doing. I think most of which, the Brent contracts and the WTI is still below that 100 level mark. So, yeah, it's not all in when it comes to sort of the risk on, as Citi has said. But then again, you are seeing a little bit of that optimism that's being tempered here this morning, given some of the doubts that we've seen in the last 24 hours about what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz, also what's going on in Lebanon and Iran really targeting all those sites of Hezbollah. So certainly that is one thing that's still kind of overshadowing some of the movement there. But we got to talk about the tech angle to all this as well. There might be still some key themes to watch out for. Onshore markets are looking like this this here, we're still seeing a bit of downside here. So we're coming off some of the initial highs from yesterday. Now we're down about 0.9% for Shanghai. You take a look at when it comes to Shanghai crude as well. We're still slightly seeing that risk premium being reduced, right? We're seeing 3% lower when it comes to Shanghai crude futures there as well. Large caps are mostly to the downside here today. It's really led by the likes of CATL, also Capricorn Tech. That's certainly one thing to watch, is really kind of the chip space, given what we're seeing in Korea, given what we're seeing in Taiwan. Very heavy foreign buying yesterday into that sort of AI supply chain sort of theme. You take a look at how Hong Kong is. Obviously, the whole software side of things is one thing to contend with today, given what we heard from Meta coming out with their latest AI model. You got Anthropic launching cloud-managed agents as well. We're watching very closely Alibaba as well. Quite a slashing in terms of price target to around 185 from Jefferies there. They're citing when it comes to that bigger AI spend. And really when it comes to other segments of the business here that could be still at a loss. So certainly that's one thing to watch here, because they said, given what we see in the subsidies, the other things segment could be the one to watch in terms of the headwinds there. The stock is down, there you go, 3%, following what we saw in the ADRs overnight. HS Tech is on offer here today. We're down about 1.5% or so. It's really good, led the likes of Baba, Meituan, Xiaomi are all seeing some pretty pronounced moves to the downside here today. And even when it comes to just overall, Hang Seng is down by 0.7%. So there you go. A little bit of strength in the currency here, but certainly we are just kind of coming off some of the initial lows of the dollar. So we're coming off that a little bit. Software is key in focus here. As I talked about the Meta story, the Anthropic story. Here you go. You are seeing the likes of Kingsoft and the like down some 3% here this morning.
Yeah, okay, let's pivot back to the big issue, of course, at hand. It's to what extent is this a ceasefire? I mean, when you look at how markets are trading, Yvonne just went through the Chinese Open there. I think S&P futures are now down 0.3%. Oil is back on the way up. There was a conversation. The world did come together somewhat to bring the two sides to the table. China's role was really part and parcel to, even you heard that from the U.S. president this time yesterday. So how do we need to be thinking about this moving forward? Let's bring back Wang Jin, senior fellow at the Beijing Club for International Dialogue. Wang Jin, thanks for being patient and sticking around. The Donald Trump's trip to China was postponed because of what's happening now, and I think we're still scheduled for that trip to Beijing in mid-May. Can I just ask maybe a direct question? Can that summit between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump still take place if the war continues, or is a cessation of hostilities almost a precondition for that summit to take place?
Well, of course, I hope that every kind of the summit between China and the United States could preview successfully. And although we know there is still some kind of the interventions from the Iranian issue, and we hope that the Iranian issue would come to the end with the peace and stability come back to this region, which is also welcomed by everybody, I think, including by the United States and Iran themselves. But we have to know there is still uncertainty. So your question is very crucial. Will this influence China and the United States summit? I think, although many people will say, okay, it's a kind of the crisis, it's a kind of uncertainty for the two countries over the international issue, because China does not want the war to continue, and China believe that United States war into Iran to some extent actually is based upon its unilateralism decision. But the problem is that I think China and the United States share the very, very common understandings over the future of the war. That is, the war should be ended. So it means we actually have the kind of opportunity to share the prospect of the future over the Iranian issue, over the regional issue. That is, the region should come back to the stability, that the war should be suspended. Although there were some difficulties and divisions in the region, that means that the different sides should be finished and should overcome this kind of the divisions through the political and the dialogue ways. So that's why I think China and the United States, we still have a lot of understandings, common understandings, although we have misunderstandings or maybe the different views before. But I think it's an opportunity for further enhance the consensus between the two countries. This is a very important thing. I think we can create something much more positive by the two leaders together. David.
Wang Jin, I want to bring up something that one of our columnists had mentioned, Krishna Vaswani, about really the role that China is playing in the international world order now, that it's almost like an effective opposition sort of voice to what we're hearing from the U.S., right? For many governments, the issue is not really managing China, it's navigating the uncertainty generated by Washington. In terms of what regional countries are looking at the situation here right now, China seems like that sort of stabilizing sort of voice. How do you think the rest of the world should be? Does it change the calculus on how nations look at China now in some ways? Does it become, are they forced to kind of choose sides in a way that maybe does put China back in favor?
Well, I feel very happy because when somebody saying that right now that, as you mentioned, say that United States and other countries are the troublemakers, and China becomes now the trouble enders. So that's why I think it's maybe the very positive praise for China. But we actually, I think from my point of view, that we're actually living in the world where everything's overlapped, where every kind of the relations is interacting with each other. So we cannot say that some countries are making trouble where other countries are trying to manage this trouble. This is unfair because we cannot say that China should manage every crisis, every trouble is made up by other countries. We call it unfair. And also, on the other hand, we cannot forget that we are living in a country where everything is interacted with each other. So China alone cannot manage every troubles, and because when some other countries are still making troubles, we cannot say that China can do it alone. And we should work closely together with other countries, particularly as we see what has happened between United States and Iran. Of course, China do something and try to bring the different conflicting parties closer, try to manage to melt down the divisions between the two different conflicting parties, try to alleviate the tension in this region. But we cannot forget that also United States' decision is very crucial. That is, they want the peace dialogues with Iran. And Iran's opinion is also very crucial. They want try the dialogues with the United States, and also Pakistan is also important because they started a communication channel. This is very, very necessary, highly necessary right now. So that's why I think China's role is important, but I think China's role alone cannot work. So that's why we need everybody's efforts right now, Yvonne.
So far, I think China has certainly put diplomatic pressure, as with others, for the both sides to come together. This is a two-part question, and forgive me, I might spend a little bit of time just fleshing out the concept. Yeah. So when I look at countries in the Asia Pacific that are U.S. allies, Japan, Korea, Philippines come to mind, that alliance is also tethered to a security guarantee from the United States. And I wonder, as we pivot further into the future and as people look to China, can folks look to China to provide, this is a two-part of it, somewhat of security guarantees that the U.S. somewhat provides their allies currently? And if China needs to do more specifically in maintaining peace in the Middle East, do you think China has a role to play in guaranteeing security, say in the Strait of Hormuz or in the Arab Peninsula?
I think it's actually what is happening in Hormuz is suggested very clearly that only military guarantee cannot guarantee anything. Because as we can see that when Iran started to close Hormuz, even United States has the most powerful military forces in this world. Even they have the aircraft carrier groups near the Hormuz Strait. They could do nothing. The Hormuz Strait is under closure. Iran used only very simple weapons. I mean, the drones and the short-range missiles. They could close the Hormuz Strait, and the United States just could watch and do nothing else. So that's why I think, as you mentioned, it is very good that in the East Asian Pacific areas, there were a lot of countries who are allies of the United States. I think it is because of results of history. Because in the history, particularly in the Cold War, these countries, they choose to stand with the United States. This is the continuation of the Cold War. So from the China's perspective and China's thinking methods, that we should, to some extent, reform this kind of the thinking methods. It means that only military guarantee cannot make everybody safe. It only make everybody a rivalry, make everybody standing against each other and preparing for the future war. So when the war started, or even under the preparation of the war, nobody is safe and everybody will affected negatively. So that's why the new thinking method and security method should be established. That is the end of the war, and try to solve the problems through the diplomatic way and through the political dialogue. Everybody should contribute over the kind of the prosperous co-shared future.
Wang Jin, we got to leave it there, but thank you so much for your
Thank
time
you.
and perspective, of course. A senior fellow at Beijing Club for International Dialogue. Coming up, we'll be digging into the fallout of the Iran war as well. One of Japan's largest shipping companies, Mitsui O.S.K. Lines, its CEO, joining us next. This is Bloomberg.
Well, we've already seen an increase in traffic today. Hopefully, we'll see an increase in traffic tomorrow. We actually think that we are seeing signs that the Straits is starting to reopen. I think you guys have probably seen oil prices have come down. So I think the oil markets, the gas markets are seeing the same thing.
The U.S. Vice President there, J.D. Vance, following the ceasefire agreement between Tehran and Washington. Let's bring in Sherry on, our Asia Trade co-anchor with us in Tokyo, with perhaps a perfect guest to talk us through some of the logistical bottlenecks in that part of the world. Sherry.
Yeah, what a perfect time, as you said, David, because I'm now joined by the head of one of Japan's largest shipping and logistics company, Jotaru Tamura, CEO of Mitsui O.S.K. He just took the helm on April 1st. So I want to say congratulations on your new post, but at the same time, I know that you're facing unprecedented times. How's the business going right now with the impact from the Iran war?
Yeah, good morning, Sherry. Yeah, it's very difficult times for everyone, not just for us. The situation literally changes every day. Yeah. So the temporary ceasefire said to be yesterday is basically a good news for us, but it's temporary and for 2 weeks. So what we are doing is to verify the conditions that whether the ships can go through the straits. Yeah. So hopefully the vessels in the Gulf can move now, but then after 2 weeks, then we have to see what are the situations there. So we are still in a very much in between.
What are you hearing right now? Because I think a lot of the challenge has been understanding this ceasefire, especially given that Iran says that they still need to get permission from them in order to pass the Strait of Hormuz.
It's just within 24 hours. So we are really in the process to verify the situations. So it's a bit too early to tell, but I expect in coming days, then we see what it means to us, and then I expect the shipping lines can take actions.
What do you need to see in that ceasefire in order to feel comfortable to let your vessels pass by?
It's the high-level agreement we can see from the all the reports. So how it is implemented in the water, that's something that we really need to understand. So, yeah.
We already heard, though, that you had a few vessels passing through the strait already, especially this week. Is that correct?
The couple of vessels have had a chance to go through, but that's an individual situation, and we can't really make any comments because we are setting the priority on the security of the each individual vessels. So in order to avoid any impacts to them. So that's how we describe the situation at the moment.
Because you also had a cargo container ship also hit last month, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So are you getting the approval from the Iranian side of things?
The vessel, the container ship in question, is still in the Gulf, and we are waiting to resolve the situation. Yeah.
With the Iranian authorities?
Well, we are obviously the main counterpart for us is the Japanese government. Yeah. So then we are working with them very closely to find out the situation.
Do you have to pay a fee in order to transit right now?
We are not really involved in the government the relationships. Yeah.
Is that a concern, though, that we're hearing that perhaps Iran wants to make this systematic toll in order to be able to transit the Strait of Hormuz?
We see all these informations back and forth, but it is not really for us to make any comments on this. So we are waiting for the situations really at the moment.
We heard that the Prime Minister Takaichi has actually spoken to the Iranian president. What else do you need to see from the Japanese government?
So we are actually waiting for the feedback from the government side. So I believe it's under development at the moment. Yeah.
How many vessels do you have around the area?
We are not disclosing the number of vessels because of the security as a top priority. But we understand that government we understand that government recognizes that 42 vessels in the Gulf as the Japan-related vessels, and we are some of them is actually ours. Yeah.
Given that we don't know how the ceasefire will unfold, how do you mitigate the situation? Are you finding alternative routes, and what does that mean for your bottom line in terms of costs?
Well, the vessels at the moment, let's say the vessels within the Gulf at the moment, it's a top priority. So hopefully the developing situation allows us to move them after this 5-6 weeks of waiting time. Yeah, but then we really have to see the situation, how that develops after these 2 weeks. Then that's a very big thing for us as a next step. Otherwise, the situation wouldn't be that unsustainable. So we need a sustainable stability for continuing sending the vessels. So that's the really key thing.
Because the issue is not that Strait is open or closed, right? It's the feeling of comfort and safety for your vessels and crew. At what point and what variables do you need to see in order to decide this is okay?
Well, that's a difficult question. Yeah, I mean, as I say, then at least there's a kind of agreement for short term now. But the key for us is how it's implemented in the water. So we really have to see that. Yeah.
The costs associated with insurance, with fuel surcharges, what are you seeing on that side, and how will that affect your business, especially given that you just announced your 5-year plan last week, right?
Yeah. There's a very short term and long term, in my view. Yeah. The very short term is the things like we have to save the situations for the vessels and currently in the Gulf. Yeah, so hopefully that will have a positive impact from the announced ceasefire. Short term, obviously, the world is being impacted by the lack of the oil transport and some other materials. So I think it's to quite an extent inevitable that the shipping market has to be bearing the reactions of the shortage, possible shortage of the bunker. Then it works as a restrictive for the supplies to the market. Yeah, so we already see some of the segments are in terms of the freights is upwards. Yeah, so that's probably the short term. But for long term, what can be seen is that if this is really prolonged, then the impacts to the manufacturing industries and so on. So quite possibly the volume of the cargo can go up and down, and then it's probably down first. But afterwards, then all the industry will have to look at the supply chain resilience, and so it's quite possibly that means more stock and the more purchase to refill what has gone down. So I would anticipate for mid-long term, it's probably quite up and down.
Just quickly, given that, of course, we have the tariff situation in the background as well, and activist investor Elliott coming out saying that you need to be more aggressive on your shareholder return plans, how difficult and challenging is the situation at the moment right now to be able to do that?
I see that shipping market by nature is up and down, but because of this geopolitical impact, for in coming years, it can be more up and down or more volatile. But what it means to us is that for last 3 years, we have been focusing much more on stabilizations of our portfolio, meaning building the larger portion of more stable earning businesses.
Okay.
And that's I see that is more in a positive in the sense that under the current circumstances, that can function as differentiations of ourselves. So based on that, then we expect that we can take more positive on the shipping markets.
Right.
Yeah.
Jotaru, Tamura, really good to have you with us in the Tokyo studio. He's the CEO of Mitsui O.S.K. Alliance as we continue to follow the latest developments around the Iran war. This is Bloomberg.
Okay, we're looking at this rally across some parts of the tech space, some of the automakers. It does seem China Energy seems to be China Energy, China AI seems to be re-emerging. I think that's really a very good symptom or proxy of maybe to many investors, increasingly so by the day, that the war may be relegated somewhat as a risk. We'll talk more really how we should be thinking about those two things right now. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to the China Show. Here's a look at the CSI 300 a half hour into the session, and we're seeing most regional benchmarks are slightly lower, and China has been sort of joining on that fray. That euphoric sort of rally that we saw yesterday is being tempered just lightly here. We take a look at how the equity space is doing. Is this just a fragile truce, or are we still seeing some hope of permanent peace? That's the key question here for the market here right now. But yes, we have seen some signs that there is some doubt in this sort of ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran.
It wasn't going to be as simple as the headline suggested. And I think Mark Cranfield, out of our MLive TV, I think put it very perfectly, I think, when you look at how investors are looking at this, right? They caught a glimpse of the exit for the very first time. Now, that exit, that view is still fairly straightforward. It's still there. It's just getting there is not going to be as simple, right? And I think the fact that for the base case now for markets is that we are on both sides now have an indication of wanting to de-escalate the situation. And I think markets just needed that off-ramp to be as visible as it still is for this to take place. Now, it's obviously going to be not going to go in a straight line. In fact, when you look at markets right now, I think Nikkei, to Yvonne's point, most benchmarks are down all the way through to the topics index, the Kospi. Japan is entering its last 30 minutes of the session here, morning session as far as Tokyo is concerned. Can we change the page, please? Thank you. There we go. Taiwan, though, is getting, I think, as a reminder that there is something else happening besides the war as far as investors' mindset is concerned. Taiwan and some of the tech plays there are doing some punching above literally some of their index weights are concerned. The dollar is interesting because the dollar is now actually reversed completely all the gains for 2026, and going into the war in the thick of it, it reversed all the weakness in 2026. So we're almost back to square one on the Bloomberg Dollar Index. The Fed minutes did suggest that if it was prolonged, they might need to hike interest rates if it was prolonged.
They're still keeping rate hikes on the table, it seems, just given that the inflation concerns. So there is that sort of two-sided sort of rate risks in bonds here right now, right? Yes, there might be some sort of ceasefire that lowers the odds of recession in some ways, but then again, also limits the amount of rate cuts too as well. So there you go. That's why you're seeing when it comes to the Treasury market, we basically reversed a lot of the gains that we saw already yesterday here. 4.29 we have on your U.S. 10-year yield, and you are seeing yields pick up once again in Japan and Australia here this morning. Commodity side of things, certainly that's been interesting. What gold prices have done, of course, they've come back in some ways. Silver still slightly in the downtrend here this morning, but you are still seeing when it comes to oil markets are a little bit more elevated here. So we're up about 2% for Brent, though still below $100 for Brent as well as WTI. There is still a lot of uncertainty about what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz, right? So a part of this whole ceasefire before was that Iran did indicate that they were going to open up some of the waterways there for some vessels, right? But I think once we heard news of what Iran and what has been one of the biggest, or Israel, I should say, one of the biggest sort of attacks in Lebanon since this war began, I think that's when Iran came through and said, look, we're effectively keeping it shut. That's why you're seeing, right, hundreds of vessels that are still sitting idle there.
Yeah, sitting, waiting for the strait to open. And I think Laura Davison made a very good point, right? Both sides have different versions of what the ceasefire means, right? 10-point plan, 15-point plan. Free flow of vessels and traffic, according to the U.S., according to Iran, of course, the safeguarding of those vessels via their control. So according to our data, so this is the latest data, in fact, here, so there has been virtually no pickup in vessel traffic, and that covers bulk, commercial cargo, dry cargo, and as far as the oil markets go, oil tankers over the last 24 hours. And that 24-hour window is, of course, when that ceasefire was first announced.
Yeah, so that ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran still remains fragile after Tehran says it was violated after Israeli strikes against Hezbollah militia in Lebanon. Take a listen.
If Iran wants to let this negotiation fall apart in a conflict where they were getting hammered over Lebanon, which has nothing to do with them and which the United States never once said was part of the ceasefire, that's ultimately their choice.
That was the U.S. Vice President there is set to, of course, lead talks with Iran and Pakistan on Saturday morning, local time. Let's bring in Jomana Bersetchi, our Horizons Middle East and Africa anchor. She's with us in Dubai. Jomana, we were talking, I think, almost this time yesterday before your show started that there were already doubts at that point in time that this was as clear-cut, the ceasefire was as clear-cut as some of the headlines suggested. Where are we now, 24 hours on?
Yeah, well, people are insisting that the ceasefire is still holding. When I say people, I say the U.S. administration is insisting that this is actually a ceasefire. But I think there are lots of questions about the sustainability of the ceasefire. It's certainly extremely fragile. Yesterday, take a case in point. You continue to see projectiles being fired at many Gulf nations. You had over here in the UAE more than a dozen missiles being intercepted throughout the course of the day. In Kuwait as well, more interceptions going on, sirens being sounded in Bahrain, and then later in the afternoon, an attempted drone attack on that crucial east-west pipeline in Saudi Arabia. So the Gulf region still dealing with incoming projectiles. And at the same time, what you saw was a real intensification of Israeli operations in Lebanon as well. It's bloodiest days since the war began. And Israeli Prime Minister, shortly after we spoke 24 hours ago, did say that while Israel were subscribing to the U.S.-Iran ceasefire, Lebanon was not part of the equation. And herein lies the issue, because there are conflicting narratives about what exactly was included in the respective proposals put forward by the U.S. and Iran in order to get to this ceasefire. U.S. maintained that Lebanon was not included in the 10-point proposal. Iran are saying that it was included in the proposal. And now, overnight, the Speaker of the Parliament, Mohammed Ghalibaf, who's going to be a key negotiator this weekend if the talks do go ahead in Islamabad, has said that there have been multiple violations of the ceasefire of the first 24 hours, and one of them are the specific violations that have occurred in Lebanon.
Yeah, and does this only just limit then what could come out of these talks heading into the weekend now?
And that's a big question, because from here, one of the other things that people are asking is what are going to be the basis of discussions as we go into Friday? And you look at the status quo today, where are we? Where are things now? Well, as I mentioned, projectors are still being fired. The war in Lebanon, for all intents and purposes, is intensifying as opposed to de-intensifying, which is a non-starter from Iran's perspective. And the strait, as you guys were just talking about, is still effectively closed. According to Bloomberg monitoring, I think only 3 ships managed to make it through successfully yesterday, and many are deciding to hold back out of safety concerns. And so the starting point for these negotiations is one, of course, pushing for that reopening of the Straits. One of the terms that Iran were insisting for is sovereignty, or introducing some form of a toll booth or a transit fee for ships that are passing through. Clearly, that is a non-starter as well. And at the same time, you've got to bring down the intensity in the region before we can talk about turning this temporary truce into a full cessation of hostilities. And I will just say, people in the Gulf have started to question whether GCC states were actually included in this ceasefire as well. And I think that is going to be another overarching question as we get closer to what might be those key in-person discussions taking place in Islamabad this week. Confirmed, by the way, that J.D. Vance will be attending alongside Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner.
Yeah, and Jomana, speaking of GCC, I mean, where you are, I mean, we understand that the UAE has said that the nuclear and military capabilities of Iran must be addressed. And I just go back to one of the conversations we had, I think it was yesterday or the day before, where going into the ceasefire, one has to ask, has the U.S. actually also, achieved their objectives of nullifying that nuclear threat or that potential nuclear threat?
An interesting comment put out by the UAE's Ministry of Foreign Affairs overnight, and they said and this echoes other Ministry of Foreign Affairs around the region. They say that they support the ceasefire and would like to see it turn into something more permanent. But at the same time, and this is language that came through from the UAE, the conclusion of the war needs to coincide with the reduction of all of those things that you list, Iran's ability to launch ballistic missiles, a cessation of hostilities and acts of aggression against countries around the region, including the Gulf states, ensuring that they don't go on to develop a nuclear weapon. So very similar to the language that the U.S. have been using. And you could argue that even after 40 days of war, and today is the 41st day of war, there's still big question marks as to whether these military objectives have been fully achieved. Because even if the U.S. are projecting this image of having won militarily, at the end of the day, Iran is still firing missiles. They're still firing drones. They're still sitting on this arsenal of weapons that they're capable of deploying if they want to cause damage. And that is something that they've identified as well. So in addition to the new additional political leverage of the Strait of Hormuz, they've also realized that they can inflict a significant amount of damage using these lower cost drones. And that as well is unacceptable for countries in the Gulf region.
Jomana, thank you. Jomana Bersetchi there, Horizons Middle East and Africa anchor. Joining us now to talk us through the markets component of this, how much we should be moving on from this, if at all, the war, I mean, and looking at other themes. Christina Woon, portfolio manager at Eastspring Investments, is with us now out of Singapore. Christina, good morning. Good morning from Hong Kong. I mean, I'm torn by asking what might sound like an insensitive question. I guarantee you it's not. But should investors start moving away from being solely focused on what's going on in the Middle East?
Well, I mean, it's difficult, I think, to move away from that because these are the headlines that you see every day. So I think that the way I would approach it is while you have an eye on what's happening globally, and obviously that's giving a lot of fluctuations to the market, you also have to try to look beyond that and position for the future as well. So I think that's why these times are tricky, but also can be quite interesting from an opportunity perspective because you can capitalize on some of the nearer term volatility to also pick up some gems over the longer term. There are some thematics I do think that still will stand out to be winners over the longer term. You touched on tech earlier as well in this session. I think that that could also be interesting even in this current correction.
So the price action that we're seeing, do you think this is just really comes down to, momentum strategies, algos, really? I mean, do you see any sort of, fundamental sort of signs of a beginning of something that is enduring?
Yes, I think absolutely. I mean, if we think about how we started off the year, one of the key things that many of us, I would say, from an investor standpoint, have had to relook would be our stance on energy. So if we go back to January, most people were thinking about or discussing perhaps oil prices hitting 50, but you look at where we are right now. You would have taken positions on the back of that January position. You would have thought of how inflation would be, rates, etc. Many of us are having to relook that going forward, because like it or not, even with a ceasefire, I do think that you can't unwind some of the things that have happened. We would have to get comfortable with the fact that oil prices, even if they come off from here with any peace, will likely land a bit higher than they were pre-conflict. So you have to adjust your positioning on the back of that as well. And then inflation and growth, etc., etc.
Oh, you set up my next question then. How have you adjusted your positions?
Yeah, I would have to. I mean, when I think about energy, I think that's one of the key things that I've had to really weigh up, because the example that I gave earlier about my view on oil at the start of the year, that's something we've had to reassess. So the way I've looked at strategy, for example, is we have to be practical in these times, and that comes down to two things. So number one, when you're in a situation where there are binary outcomes, or almost binary outcomes, it's ceasefire, no ceasefire, is a straight open or not, you definitely need to have some sort of balance in your portfolio. So that's having some sort of conflict proxies, like within energy, but also ensuring that outside of that you have post-conflict winners as well, for example, tech, as we touched on earlier. And then secondly, because you don't want both sides, the conflict and the non-conflict sides of your strategy, to offset each other, active investing then becomes really important, because while your beta is managing risk, your alpha is what's going to drive things from an idiosyncratic perspective. So that's really how the playbook has been over this time. I think balance becomes really quite important in navigating this volatility.
You mentioned tech. I'm guessing it's the AI trade. What we've been seeing is software certainly is in question, just given what we've been seeing with what these big mega tech players have been launching in terms of AI agents and the like. But it seems like in Asia, the sort of theme about picks and shovels, AI infrastructure and demand for that is still quite strong. Would you agree with that sort of narrative?
Yes, I think, I mean, obviously at the start of the conflict, we did see quite a bit of a correction in that trade, understandably as well, as markets go risk off. But what we've seen play out over the past few weeks is that this AI capex boom has been a bit more resilient than expected. And it's not just from a sentiment perspective. If you look at some of the earnings that have been coming out, or some of the rhetoric that's been coming out from some of the companies, it still continues to be quite positive. And again, back to what I sort of mentioned about some things that just can't be unwound. AI is another example of that. At an enterprise level, at a consumer level, this has started to get embedded into many of our lives as well, and ways of living and working. It's very hard to then stop that immediately, so that investment continues, and being in the picks and shovels within Asia has actually been quite beneficial over this period of conflict. And that's actually added some resilience, I would say, to strategies here in Asia.
Yeah, I mean, that Samsung prelim number, how good was that, Christina? Eightfold. I just wonder right now, what's your granular look at AI within just the different emerging themes that are within that broader conversation?
Yeah, I would say, for example, the bottlenecks in memory, as you've seen with some of the big Korean memory makers, that continues to remain intact, and that's also helped by the very tight supply situation. I would say another thing that's actually quite topical for now would be some of the server ODMs. Some of the monthly sales and earnings have also come out of there. And it's not just within the AI servers that have been where the numbers have been holding up well. It's also within the general server space. So that's quite a broad or good picture to see that actually this demand has been holding up quite well. And I think the benefit within the server ODMs as well is the fact that depending on which company you pick within the Taiwan server space, you also get a bit of dividend yield on the back of that. So that kind of stable return that you get from dividends and income is also helpful in this current time. So that's actually quite nice.
Christina, thank you. Nice to speak with you. Christina Woon there, of course, in Singapore, portfolio manager at Eastspring Investments, really laid out what the different adjustments and how maybe some of the assumptions need to be rethought, some, not all, out of Singapore there. Right, just ahead, speaking of, we touched on the macro there, the RBNZ has its eye on inflation as fuel price pressure from the Iran war bites. We hear from its governor next. This is Bloomberg.
New Zealand Central Bank Governor Anna Breman says officials will act decisively if they see any acceleration in core inflation. She spoke with us a day after the central bank held rates at 2.25%.
We are seeing and expecting higher near-term inflation and somewhat weaker growth in the New Zealand economy. And then what we are really focused on is the medium-term inflation and ensuring that medium-term inflation is at target. And of course, in this environment, it's very hard to do forecasting. We had the meeting at 9 a.m. in the morning. It was announced at 2 p.m. So there was a lot of information in between. But we knew that that could happen. So we had taken that into consideration, of course, at the time of the meeting.
If in fact we see global energy supplies restored, some of the risks to global supply chains minimised in the coming days or weeks or months, and we accept that the risk to inflation is a near-term and a temporary one, do you foresee a scenario where easing is back on the table?
Well, we are more focused on ensuring that medium-term inflation does not increase. We see that the balance of risks have shifted in terms of inflation and more risk on the upside because already right now in New Zealand, fuel prices have gone up considerably, both petrol, but in particular diesel, and that's important input into transport in general, but also into the agricultural sector that is big here. And that risk getting passed on then into food prices and other kinds of prices. So we are expecting somewhat weaker growth, but we are concerned that medium-term inflation pressures could be higher. And if we start seeing inflation expectations moving up, if we see that core inflation is moving up, if we see wage growth picking up, then we said that we will act decisively to ensure that medium-term inflation goes back to target, the midpoint of the target, and that's 2%.
Government, does that put a July rate hike on the table? Markets seem to be pricing that in.
We don't have a forward-looking OCR track at this meeting. When we do our monetary policy statements quarterly, we provide our guidance for the OCR going forward. Now what we're saying is we are focusing on the things that we are looking at to decide whether or not we need to hike the OCR. And in particular, we're looking in any signs that medium-term inflation pressures are going up. So that is things like the inflation expectations, wage growth, if we see core inflation starting, not just headline inflation, because we know headline inflation will be going up, but also core inflation moving upwards. Those could be reasons to do a rate hike.
When it comes to inflation, do you believe the price setters within the country, firms, are acting appropriately to reflect higher prices? Or is there a danger and risk that they could be taking advantage of the situation?
Well, price setting behavior is always really important, and there are many different ways of looking at it. We're engaging actively with the business community, trying to both do surveys, but also actually meeting with businesses to get good information currently. What we're hearing now is that some firms are planning on hiking their prices. Some are doing temporary fuel surcharges that could then be removed if we see the fuel prices going back down. And some people are saying that they can't pass on higher costs to consumers right now because demand is too weak. And exactly how this will play out, it's obviously hard to know, but we're collecting all the data we can to see where it's going. But there's always a risk that there will be some opportunistic price setting behavior in this kind of environment.
Anna Breman there, the RBNZ governor, speaking with us earlier, just a few hours back. Right, we're going into about 55 minutes into the cash market session. As you can see, declines led by tech. Not a lot, though, in terms of volumes. Lots more ahead. This is Bloomberg. Right, welcome back. We're looking at some specific parts of this equity market. Battery-related stocks in the region, everything from LG Energy, of course, is the big Korean name, going down to CATL. At some point, we were going to have to talk about this, right? This reminder, because of the war, of this perhaps need to pivot our energy mix and really looking at other sources to power economies. But yes, we are seeing a substantial rebound across some of these names here today.
Yeah, Deutsche declaring China energy the winner in this new era of the war. So certainly that's one theme to watch out here today. Asia software certainly is one, given what we heard from the likes of Meta when I was in Anthropic here. So you are seeing software being really pretty soft here this morning. WiseTech Global, for example, is down some 11%. So this was sort of the first major test for Zuckerberg's Meta Superintelligence Labs as well. So certainly that is another key theme to watch here today. We got plenty more coming up. This is Bloomberg. 11:29 a.m. in Tokyo. Japanese markets are heading to that lunch break in just a moment here, and we have seen a bit of a slightly to the downside here when it comes to equities here. So we're coming off some of the initial sort of gains and euphoric sort of optimism around the ceasefire today. A Nikkei 225 is lower by about 0.6%. Dollar yen, what we talked about is really dollar wiping out the gains of the year. A dollar coming back just a little bit here. As we start to see a little bit of reversal from the big moves yesterday. 159, just below that level for dollar yen here this morning. And JGB yields heading higher today, Dave.
Yeah, which is almost a reversal of some of the moves yesterday. Not completely, but I think in China's, in Japan's case, maybe not completely. In Treasury's case, we'll show you that later on. It's almost gone completely the opposite way, and then some more. Markets across the Asia Pacific equity market. Let's start with that. 0.9%. So we're down by a fraction compared to the euphoric gains yesterday. So we haven't quite reversed, not even close to reversing all the gains yesterday. But it is a reminder that this isn't going to go up in a straight line. We can talk about that with markets and also this path towards peace in the Middle East. Have a look at where we are with oil. So still up 2-3% last we checked, perhaps even 3.5% after the biggest drop since 2020. So we're up 2% now on Brent in West Texas. We talked about the complete reversal in the Treasury market. 10-year futures coming up on your screens, and since that initial news broke yesterday, as you can see, we're now trading at a lower level at about 111 right now, as far as the bond futures are concerned. But yes, that just goes into this concept. It's not going to be easy.
It certainly isn't. And, what sort of ceasefire are we talking about here right now? It seems like when it comes to U.S. and what Iran has agreed to, they look quite different. And Bloomberg Economics thinks when it comes to the U.S. side, President Trump has two options to end the war, and that he's prepared to pay a price to get there. Let's bring in our senior geoeconomics analyst for Asia Pacific, Adam Farrar. He joins us now. Adam, it's good to have you back in the region. Lay us out some of the scenarios that you're looking at now.
So the reality right now is that there are no clean options for the president as he tries to look towards de-escalating the current conflict and ending in a place that could see, energy prices start to drop, as we saw in the last couple of days, and really reopening the Strait of Hormuz. The first is to compromise with Iran and try and find a negotiated settlement that addresses Iran's concerns while theoretically trying to protect the broader interests of the United States and its partners, particularly Israel, and its concerns about Iran's ambitions on its nuclear program and its military activity, particularly its ballistic missiles and its support for proxies. But there are obviously lots of problems with that approach, given the fact that Iran has shown a lack of interest in cooperating, or at least finding middle ground on many of these issues, including the question of enrichment. Now, on the other side is this, the potential for re-escalation and further military action in the region, which could happen at any time, to try and raise the costs for Iran and force them to the table on better terms. But so far, Iran certainly doesn't seem to be interested in kind of making those concessions, and more importantly, seems to feel that a lengthened conflict is actually in its interests as energy prices continue to rise if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed.
So what options does J.D. Vance have going into talks this week, and what realistically can we expect from the U.S. side?
So the reality is that these talks are going to be incredibly complicated, and J.D. Vance, the vice president, has an incredibly difficult task in front of him in convincing the regime that this is a real off-ramp for them that makes sense and that they have to compromise or face additional pain. But again, the regime so far has been willing to accept that pain. And the question then becomes, how much is the United States willing to adjust its objectives and find a way to accept a new status quo that may or may not be positive from the perspective of its regional partners, particularly the Gulf and or Israel. And one of those big issues is what the Strait of Hormuz will look like moving forward. There's the first question of actually getting ships moving. But the second question is whether or not that is under Iranian control or returns to a free passage as it was prior to the conflict.
And Adam, it's interesting. We did speak with Wang Jin. He's from a Beijing think tank about really China's role in all this. We talked about how there was maybe some last-ditch effort from Beijing to try to get Iran to agree to some sort of ceasefire. We spoke to Wang Jin about just the influence that Beijing might have when it comes to this Iran conflict. I want you to take a listen to what he had to say.
I don't quite understand that why there was so many criticism that, okay, China should do this, China should do that. On one hand, China is strong, but not that enough to be able to influence every country's leader's decision over the very specific and particular issue. That is impossible because China is only a normal country in the international community. China cannot determine the other country's decision and cannot determine the other country's behaviors, including Iran and the United States. They are independent countries based upon their own independent decision-making circle.
So in some ways, it seems like he's downplaying China's sort of influence in some ways. How do you see it? Do you think this is an active shift by China here, that from being just something that is more of a reactive sort of role to something that's more assertive when it comes to foreign policy?
So I think this crisis presented an opportunity for Beijing to make that shift, as you said. Certainly, the big difference here was not only the fact that it maintains good ties with Tehran and the Gulf and has this growing relationship and important relationship with the U.S., but the simple reality of how reliant it is on the Strait of Hormuz for the supply of its own critical energy supplies. But so far, it doesn't look like China really did step up in this moment. In fact, while supporting Pakistan, the reporting we have would point to Pakistan actually being the one potentially pushing Beijing to get engaged and to get Iran across the finish line. Now, to be clear, we don't know what was happening in the background, but so far we just haven't seen the signs that Beijing has shifted from its past, more back approach to taking letting the world work through these crises while Beijing waits for it to conclude, rather than being a direct participant in such negotiations.
Adam, thank you. Adam Farrar there, Senior Geoeconomics Analyst for Asia Pacific, joining us out of our Singapore office here this morning. Let's get more with our China correspondent, Min Lo. She's been kind of tracking what, social media, what, we're seeing in state media as well. What do we see? Like, do we know that in terms of the nature and extent in which China played the sort of facilitator role?
Yeah, I think this is a very nuanced discussion because we've been hearing so many different views, and the truth is we just don't really know what happens behind the scenes. And there were so many questions yesterday at the Foreign Ministry press briefing. 9 questions posted to the spokesperson, who kept sidestepping and refused to explicitly state exactly what China did in the hours just ahead of the ceasefire. Yes, we have New York Times reporting based on conversations from 3 Iranian officials that China did step in at the last minute to implore the Iranians to be flexible and to diffuse the tension and come to the table there. And President Trump also acknowledged that he thinks China played a role there. But just now we did have Wang Jin right He is from a think tank that advises the Chinese government. He was very clear that China did not intervene. He did not want to use that word. The foreign ministry did lay out all the things they have done so far, including Wang Yi making 26 calls to various counterparties of the war since the war started, including sending a peace envoy to the region, including the 5-point peace plan that they put out together with Pakistan. And I think it's interesting that China seems to be more comfortable working things behind the scene, but is not comfortable going very public about it. And I think this speaks to China's official stance of non-interference in other countries' internal affairs. Because this is clearly someone else's war that China has publicly said it doesn't want to help clean up, and it's clearly someone else's internal affairs. And I've been speaking to people in China that are saying that, this is perhaps not necessarily an active intervention. It is also China protecting its right to development and ensuring that whatever chaos is happening there doesn't spill over and come to China's doorstep as well.
Yeah, because there are indirect repercussions that China has to deal with, not even talking about the need to intervene directly. I think what did stand out from that conversation earlier on with Wang Jin was it seemed like he was downplaying the role, or basically telling us that the world is expecting a little bit too much when directly in terms of what China's role should be. Longer term then, in terms of what the next moves are from China, what can we expect?
Yeah, it's hard to say, right? Clearly, the next catalyst is the talks that are going to happen in Islamabad. And I think we can be assured that whatever happens there, Islamabad is going to keep Beijing abreast of what is happening, because already Pakistan has emerged as a very important interlocutor. And 2 weeks ago, when they hosted a four nations dialogue with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, the foreign minister of Pakistan immediately then flew to Beijing to keep them updated. And we have Wu Xinbo, who is a Fudan University professor in Shanghai. He believes that China played a role in actively encouraging Pakistan to play mediator and in actively encouraging Iran to come to a deal. Whether or not China will take a bigger role, because Iran's envoy in Beijing had publicly named Beijing as a potential candidate as a security guarantor for a longer lasting peace deal. So far, there has been no signs that China is willing to play that role. And earlier we heard from Wang Jin, he doesn't believe that military guarantees is a path to peace, right? And China's state media has repeatedly said, and they have vetoed that UN proposal as well, that would open the door to using force to secure the Strait of Hormuz. That doesn't seem to be something Beijing is willing to do as well.
You've been looking at social media, state media. What are some of the reactions so far?
Yeah, it's interesting, and a lot of people are just putting forth their opinion. And if you flash some of these quotes that we have seen, one person is saying, look at what Pakistan has done. And after all, Pakistan is a small country. Behind Pakistan is China. And nobody can trust that a small country like Pakistan can act as a security guarantor. Only a so-called mysterious Great Eastern Power has the weight to pull it off. That's what someone on social media has said. And other people saying, looks like President Trump is going to visit China now, because he has to thank China for what has gone down over the past 24 hours. He can't come empty-handed. So perhaps this is sort of, the moves that the U.S. has to do ahead of the Trump-Xi summit.
Min, thank you. Min Lo, our China correspondent there. Great stuff. You can get more, by the way, on this story on our Video Hub. Subscribers can explore live streaming news, interviews, all of the Bloomberg TV content, shows, and everything in between. Check it out, bloomberg.com/videos. Let's have a look at Asian software names as investors perhaps mull the potential repercussions, plural, and as far as the business models are concerned here. We've been trying to triangulate, there's another big word for you, what the impact will be from this AI, this emergence of this theme of AI.
You and your fancy words. I'm just going to say software is getting whacked today, okay? I'm going to go
softer
simple.
Today.
I'm just going to tell it to you straight. Because we're going to talk about Meta, right?
Yes.
And what they debuted. This first AI model known as Muse Spark. It's the first since CEO Mark Zuckerberg embarked on this sort of multi-billion-dollar overhaul of the company's AI organization to keep pace with rivals. Let's bring in our Asia technology editor, Mark Anderson. He's with us here. So tell us a bit more about this new AI model. Where was it available? When can I see it? Tell us a bit more.
So first of all, it will be available on Meta's new AI chatbot, which it's rolling out for free with multiple modes, one of which is known as contemplating mode. So it's similar to Google Gemini and other chatbots that are on offer at the moment. And right now it's being offered for free. And we're also seeing it as Meta tries to roll out a new shopping app that will help consumers make decisions about what they buy online.
And in terms of just the significance of this, should we call it a milestone for Meta?
I think it's a warning shot. That's how I would call it.
Okay.
It's Zuckerberg's warning shot. I'm spending $14 billion revamping my AI strategy. It's also crucially closed source. So previous Meta AI models were open source, meaning that anyone could scrutinize the design and the code behind them. But now Meta is joining rivals like Anthropic, Google, and OpenAI, and rolling out a closed source model.
Yeah, I mean, Anthropic just came out with some sort of new AI agent as well overnight that really kind of moved the markets. How do you think this whole new model for Meta, though, how is it going to change the whole AI race?
I think Meta has a long way to go by its own admission, and in the Bloomberg News story, it said that this Muse Spark model is the first in a series of models that it will be releasing. So I think it's an acknowledgement that it has a long way to go to catch up with what Anthropic, ChatGPT, which has about 1 billion weekly users, right? So the bar is really, really high. Has a long way to go to catch up with those rivals.
All right, Mark, it's great to have you. Mark Anderson, our Asia technology editor, with the latest when it comes to Meta. We'll have much more coming up. This is Bloomberg. The head of Japanese shipping and logistics company Mitsui O.S.K. says the situation in Iran remains fluid. Speaking with us earlier, Jotaru Tamura says his priority is the security of his vessels.
It's very difficult times for everyone, not just for us. The situation literally changes every day. Yeah. So the temporary ceasefire said to be yesterday is basically a good news for us, but it's temporary and for 2 weeks. So what we are doing is to verify the conditions that whether the ships can go through the straits. Yeah. So hopefully the vessels in the Gulf can move now, but then after 2 weeks, then we have to see what are the situations there. So we are still in a very much in between.
What are you hearing right now? Because I think a lot of the challenge has been understanding this ceasefire, especially given that Iran says that they still need to get permission from them in order to pass the Strait of Hormuz.
It's just within 24 hours. So we are really in the process to verify the situations. So it's a bit too early to tell, but I expect in coming days, then we see what it means to us, and then I expect the shipping lines can take actions.
What do you need to see in that ceasefire in order to feel comfortable to let your vessels pass by?
It's the high-level agreement we can see from the all the reports. So how it is implemented in the water, that's something that we really need to understand. So, yeah.
We already heard, though, that you had a few vessels passing through the strait already, especially this week. Is that correct?
The couple of vessels have had a chance to go through, but that's an individual situation, and we can't really make any comments because we are setting the priority on the security of the each individual vessels. So in order to avoid any impacts to them. So that's how we describe the situation at the moment.
Because you also had a cargo container ship also hit last month, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So are you getting the approval from the Iranian side of things?
The vessel, the container ship in question, is still in the Gulf, and we are waiting to resolve the situation. Yeah.
With the Iranian authorities?
Well, we are obviously the main counterpart for us is the Japanese government. Yeah. So then we are working with them very closely to find out the situation.
Do you have to pay a fee in order to transit right now?
We are not really involved in the government the relationships. Yeah.
Is that a concern, though, that we're hearing that perhaps Iran wants to make this systematic toll in order to be able to transit the Strait of Hormuz?
We see all these informations back and forth, but it is not really for us to make any comments on this. So. We are waiting for the situations really at the moment.
We heard that the Prime Minister Takaichi has actually spoken to the Iranian president. What else do you need to see from the Japanese government?
So we are actually waiting for the feedback from the government side. So I believe it's under development at the moment. Yeah.
How many vessels do you have around the area?
We are not disclosing the number of vessels because of the security as a top priority. We understand that government recognizes that 42 vessels in the Gulf as the Japan-related vessels, and we are some of them is actually ours.
There we go. Sherry and Jotaru Tamura there, the new CEO, Mitsui O.S.K. I don't know why I sound like a boxing announcer. The new featherweight champion of the world.
That's how you should bring up every guest on the show.
That's right, if it's their first time.
Like a boxing
or
announcer.
if they got promoted. I mean, speaking of, right, I think one of the conversations, the part there was whether or not if it was open, whether he was comfortable in terms of the safety element of letting his ships pass. We have a story out, in fact, it's on the terminal right now, and I think one of the acid tests for this opening would be to see if these two specific Chinese tankers actually managed to get through the Strait of Hormuz. So they're headed to that part of the world. They're very, very close, as you can see, and I think one is actually carrying Iraqi crude?
Yes. So this is the Kospur Lake that's linked to China's COSCO shipping and the Hurong Hai, owned by a smaller entity. So they're traveling east in the Persian Gulf at near top speeds early on this Thursday morning. So both have been signaling Chinese ownership on their tracking systems. So that move typically done for safety ahead of course, these transits, right? So, and whether you get that green light from Iran. So, obviously, a successful crossing at this point is not clear. I mean, it's not guaranteed. We have seen, of course, several vessels have turned back at the last moment here. There has, of course, as David mentioned, little traffic and change in traffic over the past day. But if it does go through, they could be some of the first sort of non-Iranian tankers to make it through since this truce was announced.
There we go. Something for us to track, and we'll report back tomorrow if we see more progress on this. But yeah.
More global headlines to tell you about here. Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi has called for a lasting peace agreement during a call with Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. Now, she says the ceasefire and the situation in the Strait of Hormuz were among the topics discussed. She also reiterated Japan's request to secure the safe passage of Japanese vessels through the waterway. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says his support for the U.S.-Iran ceasefire won't affect his plans against Lebanon. That's where the military is fighting Iran-backed Hezbollah militants. But opposition politicians have expressed concerns that negotiations are being conducted on Tehran's terms.
Now, what's happened, one of the byproducts of the war in the Middle East is because of higher energy prices. You're looking at forecasts, specifically median forecast from private economists on Chinese PPI. And as you can see, the report for March, which is out this time tomorrow, is expected to show the first positive reading in nearly 4 years.
Yeah, that could be a good thing. I mean, ANZ is saying, look, bad inflation is better than deflation in China, right? So, the media will talk about headlines like it's bad, and it may aggravate domestic imbalances by hitting already weak consumption, as well as industrial profits. But they think bad inflation is problematic. It's still better, preferable to deflation here. So certainly that's one thing to discuss tomorrow as well. We'll give you a look on a last check on markets here right now. We're still off some of the lows, but still talking about markets into the downside here today. Asia Pacific lower by 0.75%. That's it for us here on the China Show. Insight with Heslin Ahmed is next. Stay with us.